FM 94, The Rock Garden, WCGY.
Some ripe happenings at the Golden Banana this weekend and the weeks to come. No matter what your age, there's something for you at the...
So you think the VTOL then is an example of one of the areas where NASA, for example, might have mounted a program of research and development to produce commercially operational VTOL.
Now, see, this could be very important to the all transportation, let's say, in the Northeast Corridor type operation.
Well, obviously nobody pressured NASA in this direction, or did they?
Oh, yeah. As a matter of fact, Congress has tried for a number of years to get the agency to take a more aggressive position in this particular area. There's a recent report prepared by the Library of Congress for one of the committees in Congress, in which they looked into the aeronautics activity in some detail.
I'm just going to move that a little bit closer. Sure. No, don't change your position. Just pick up the waves a little bit better.
They went through the whole business, studied the policy statements, charters, and past practices, and primarily for the purpose of providing a background for a set of special hearings.
Who in Congress has been behind this? Who's doing this? Has the administration been pushing NASA in this direction? Well, Hornig?
Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, the president tried to get NASA to take the lead role in the SST program, which is a good example in some respects.
Why did NASA balk at this? Why is Webb's obstinate?
I don't think it was really Webb as much as it was Dr. Dryden, who has since died. He was really quite a conservative fellow. He was a research man, and his attitude was that we don't want to become encumbered with large projects that are going to be difficult to budget, to get adequate budgetary support for, and which will drain off our scientific talent. And I think you have to realize also that the agency was very heavily, and still is very heavily committed to a mighty big national goal in the space area, and they didn't want to water down their management talent and have take any serious risk of not accomplishing that national goal of getting to the moon within this decade. So I think this was a factor. But Congress, I've read some of the testimony not too long ago, and they kept saying, why aren't you willing to do more in this area? And the agency would come back and say, it's not our policy to do anything but research in this particular field. Well, doesn't the charter allow you to do this? Yes, it does, but we have not chosen to implement that part of the charter. Now, the situation's changed rather dramatically since McNamara has come into the DOD, and you can see if you look at the numbers of experimental aircraft and feasibility demonstration type experiments, they're dropping. They have for about the last, pretty dramatically for about the last 10 years. Classically, what has happened was that NASA and the Defense Department industry formed a pretty interesting team in which NASA provided a research base through its in-house programs and worked with a few selected universities in the past. And they did a lot of parametric studies and provided quite a lot of design data. The DOD provided kind of an entrepreneurial service in that they had the mission and the money and paid industry and NASA to work out the development of experimental aircraft. They bought them, they turned them over as soon as the company proved that they had a flyable vehicle. They turned many of these experimental vehicles over to NASA to do studies and perform research on. And this worked quite well as long as the DOD was building enough of this type of experimental aircraft to keep the system going. But with the change in management philosophy, and I'm not criticizing this, just pointing out that this is a consequence of the type of policy that's been followed. There's a very strong requirement, as you know, to identify a potential need before they commit to any sort of a hardware program. And this is not only true in development, to a large extent it's true in research. There are a number of people who maintain, I'm not really close enough to be authoritative in this area, but I've heard a lot of people say that the DoD has really weakened its basic research program to a large extent as a result of this type of an approach. And maybe it's a much more efficient way to use the funds, but it has created a problem in this aeronautics area. We don't have the middle phase of the development process. We've got research, and it's fairly good. We have production, but we don't have this in-between phase where you convert the research concepts into experimental hardware that proves their feasibility and gives you some demonstration of the characteristics so that you know what you're doing on a reasonable scale.
If it is a national goal to finance or to make it a federal responsibility to develop new systems for air traffic and passenger freight to communicate, you know, whatever. Why ought this to be a DoD responsibility?
Well, it really shouldn't. It's been a byproduct of the DoD effort in the past, and there's been no need to really substitute anything else. But as their program has decreased in its output in this respect, and to an extent their requirements have diverged from the civilian requirements, something has to give. See, in the past, industry was able to take the aircraft, for example, as well as the concepts from the DoD program, and recognizing commercial markets, they made the necessary.
Well, NASA would be the natural home for this. NASA has got the capability, the personnel.
Right.
And you've been doing basic research and whatnot for the DoD, as you said a moment ago, in this area. And if you're worried about post-Apollo NASA activity.
Yeah, this is one place where it makes a lot of sense and wouldn't be too hard to do.
Yeah. Now, is there anything, are we anywhere near a decision on this?
Well, there are discussions going on within the agency now to develop its position for a series of hearings to be held in January, which Congress will explore the national policies for aircraft R&D, or aeronautical R&D. And no doubt this will be where the DOT will begin to explain what position it's going to take. And out of that, I would imagine there would be some understandings reached as to what role the two agencies will settle on.
Now, it would be interesting to me, Waller, to explore just a little bit further the whole question of who assumes responsibility for what is admittedly a. Let's assume that we'll start from the assumption that this is a national problem of importance. That one of the facts of life is that research and development in aeronautics is much of it may be beyond the capability of the private firms, even though they are sizable, that this is because of the magnitude of the sums involved and the nature of the national interest, inescapably a federal responsibility. And as you say, it's competitive. Other countries are doing it. We have both prestige, balance of payments, and many other things, including security, which is involved.
That's right.
How do you see the country handling this question?
How will the policy evolve?
Who has the responsibility to make the policy? Here's a need which is not being met, or not being met well at the moment. What do you see as the mechanisms which are going to resolve this question? You foresee a decision which is going to be made. Is it going to be made because some people are going to take the ball and push? Is it the aircraft industry that's going to provide the prime pressure toward reaching a solution?
I don't think the aircraft industry is. I haven't seen any evidence that that's the case so far.
but as a problem in this country of how we organize ourselves to deal with questions, whatever they may be, this is an interesting case in point. It would appear, for example, that we've fallen behind on the SST question, and
that's right.
There's concern that the early SSTs will be European, as already orders. TWA has ordered the Concorde, I guess.
Yes.
The Concorde may even have certain advantages because of less sonic boom. It would appear that with all the reorganizations of the federal government, with the increased perception of research, science, and technology, the use of committees, people, very competent people, very highly placed people, we still haven't necessarily got the mechanisms to make decisions.
No, we haven't.
Got pushed into Sputnik. I mean, pushed into a response to Sputnik, and we got a program going in space. Somebody pushed the panic button, but a systematic, organized method to make public decisions.
Right.
Do you see any improvement in the way we're going about that process?
Yes, I think that there are some trends that are becoming apparent. There are two examples of this that come to mind. One is the kind of institutionalization of the transportation requirement problem in the DOT, Department of Transportation. The fact that the government, I don't know in this particular case whether it was pushed by Congress or whether the push was from the executive branch. I haven't really looked at that, but somebody recognized, or some group recognized, that we had a lot of, I guess the Hoover Commission probably paid some attention to this at one time, and probably a few of these other groups at that time, but they recognized that we had a number of different agencies with parts of the problem. And nobody was doing any kind of a systematic job of tying it together. So they built what, at first blush, appears to be a kind of a holding corporation to bring together the FAA, the Civil Aeronautics Board, the all kinds of things, the Coast Guard, various regulatory groups that are involved with marine transportation, all into this new department. Now, they've been very cagey about the wording of the charter so far. They have said very little about what the authorities of this group will be. All they've said really so far is that the purpose is to get them together and to bring order out of chaos. But I think the fact that we've done this is very interesting in the light of your question, that we are beginning to take some of these major social problems on that involve technology and give them at least a focal point where people can begin to look at the alternate ways of doing jobs, trade off railroad transportation versus automobile versus aircraft systems and so on. And I would hope that out of that would come, in a kind of an operations research mode, some comparative studies that would lead to a basic structure of needs and goals that you can then identify research programs or tie research programs to. That's what I'm interested in seeing happen. Now, the second example that comes to mind is really similar to this, only it's on a much broader scale. That's the introduction of the so-called Programming, Planning, and Budgeting System, PPBS system that the Bureau of the Budget got President Johnson to inject into the machinery of government here about a year ago, a little over a year ago. And this really institutionalizes, in a sense, the program planning techniques that have been used by McNamara and by some industrial organizations to look at the reasons why we do programs the way we do, and eventually go so far as to do the cost trade-offs to see which is the most cost-effective way to do it. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I don't know about the merits of the cost-effectiveness aspect of this type of planning.
What do you mean by cost of?
Well, this is where you may have more than one way to achieve an objective, and then you make economic analyses to show what the costs are versus the benefits that are involved in the approach, and you pick the one with the highest payoff. There are a lot of uncertainties that are obviously involved, and a lot of guesswork that's involved there.
It's this cost-benefit ratio, which is
right.
referred to as the cost-effectiveness
that's it.
Technique or method.
That's it. But the fact that this begins to give you a mechanism for people to analyze the reasons for programs and make them compare alternate ways of doing business is a very interesting step forward. I see previously, there's been sort of an evolution occurring in federal budgeting for a number of years. You go back not too far, though, and you find that the budgeting was based primarily on personnel, and there was very little identification of program objectives. The agencies said, we need so many people, and with this goes a dollar budget of so much. And you add up all kinds of numbers. You're looking at numbers, and you can't really get a handle on what all this is doing, and what are the relative merits and demerits of the programs of one agency versus another, or even within a given agency of one department versus another, or one bureau, or however you want to look at it. So that all this really is sort of a formalization of a system of logic for deciding what program objectives make sense, plus the additional feature of this cost ratio, cost effectiveness factor. Now, there's a lot of opposition to the PPBS system in Washington, partly I think because of the way it was introduced. A lot of confusion as to how it's going to be used. You run into the very real people problem that many of the bureaucrats don't like to have this type of information made available to the next higher level in the machine. And this does have the tendency, it could be used if those in power wanted to use it for this purpose. It could be used to bring all of the decisions, the major decisions, to the Bureau of the Budget and the President. It can also be used, as a centralization technique. It can also be used as a decentralization technique by giving a tool based on good, sound, logical analysis to the individual program managers to think through the objectives of their programs and the consequences of these programs.
What resources are supplied to the program managers if they are unable to make the kinds of calculations that are required to execute this program?
What kind of help can they get, in other words? Well, I really don't know what the answer to that is, Stan, just how they set that business up. The implementation is so new. This is its first cycle, and not all of the agencies were required to use that this time.
Mm-hmm.
But the response has been very interesting. Some of the agencies have literally refused to do it. And frankly, NASA's one. And
why did you refuse?
Well, I think the reason is that Webb felt that these kinds of techniques were already being used internally in the agency. This is his argument. And he didn't want to get himself in a position where he was required to divulge this kind of, this level of really complete picture to the Bureau of the Budget. Now, he has the same concern, I think, in part that many of these other people do, that he has a mission and he doesn't want somebody else telling him how to do that job, making the decisions, the trade-offs between allocations of resources and a degree of detail that's further than even Congress gets into right now. And since he's been a director of the Bureau of the Budget, he knows the game pretty well and knows what he can get by with. But personally, I think it's a very interesting and useful tool. It may go a little too far in some respects. It may be that some programs are too social in nature and not hardware oriented enough to make some of these aspects really meaningful. But boy, I think it's a tremendous step forward in the kind of planning that you were asking about.
Who was responsible for the PPPs?
The original thinking, I believe, was largely done by the RAND Corporation, and of course, the initial experience with it was in the Department of Defense for the most part. There had been some similar experiments conducted years ago in the Department of Agriculture, but the real recent experience that relates specifically to this movement, I think, is largely DOD. I think you can't really argue with the merits of the case, but you can get awfully unhappy about the way it's been implemented, or the way the tool can be used.
Doesn't the Bureau of Budget, isn't the Bureau of Budget swamped with work, where the agency supplies the background analysis, identifies the trade-offs and so on?
They would be if
and they presumably make recommendations as to or proposals as to what they want to do with this backup data. And then somebody from the Bureau of the Budget has got to find out whether they've done their job right.
Well, now see, that's the problem. You can use this thing in either of two modes. It's my understanding the Bureau of the Budget is not interested at the present in centralizing the decision-making process. If they did, they would really be swamped. If they required all this information and they said, now we have all the master plans of all the agencies, we're going to do the trade-offs ourselves at a next level of detail, so to speak, it'd be an impossible job. But on the other hand, if you say I'm going to decentralize using this technique, but I'm going to insist that, in other words, decentralize in the sense that I still leave the agencies the right to decide what programs they propose to the White House. And all I'm doing is assuring myself that there is a disciplined way of looking at this thing, and that there is information available in the agency on that can be tapped if we want to explore any particular facet of this thing, then I think it's not going to overburden. That kind of an approach, it seems to me, is really the intelligent one.
Well, that's extremely interesting.
See, this thing has another very important implication to it, I believe. You have a very hard time without some kind of technique like this of really identifying what our national goals are that the government's involved in. There are very, very few, I think, that you can point to that are as explicit as putting man on the moon by 1970. Most government programs are really things that kind of evolve, and it's hard to tell after you've gotten an institution going whether its program has outlived its usefulness. And how do you smoke that out if all you're doing is looking at personnel figures and some kind of bunch of numbers and comparing trends from previous years? This gives you the ability at the gross level of detail to look at the objectives of the programs in terms of national needs, which is, they say, for example, look at Social Security. What are you really trying to do with this program? So I think in terms of providing information to what we need now is a forum, an appropriate national forum for discussing these issues, you've really got some grist for that kind of mill now.
Well, in the case of Social Security, of course, that's congressional policy. Congress wanted it, so there isn't anything the Social Security executives can do about that.
Right.
So I don't know how they...
I may have picked a bad example.
Well, I agree. That question couldn't be raised. What are we doing about, with the Social Security program? There are alternatives. But for the moment, that system is pretty much what it is because of the way the legislation is sets it up.
Of course, a person has to recognize that you will find contradictions too, and you have to expect these. For example, within the Department of Agriculture, you might have a contradiction involved in one part of the agency working like mad to improve productivity, while another part's worried about surpluses in the same product area. commodity area. And some of these things, where you're working in a kind of a client-oriented agency, you just have to accept that. The logic doesn't become pure by any stretch of the imagination, but at least you begin to be able to do these things on an organized, rational basis.
Going back to your proposal that you planned on bringing to Webb on research having to do with, well, what was it? What is the idea?
Well, really, the idea is that NASA's certainly in a period of adjustment now. It's been difficult to justify in the present environment a major commitment to something after the lunar program, the Apollo program. Certainly there are things that could be proposed. They're all very, very costly, and it's, in terms of strategy, it's a very good question as to whether you would do this at this point. So the way I look at the thing, the environment has definitely changed since 1958 in very important ways in terms of the competition for money in the government. And we've certainly seen some interesting developments in terms of the government accepting in a very overt way a kind of a social role that has evolved through a number of programs over the last 35 years or so. But it seems to me that NASA represents a major capability. It's a big and important national resource. It has a lot of people in its in-house program and in the team that has learned to work with it. Some 34,000 or 5,000 in-house employees and about 400,000 industrial and university groups that are currently working in this program. That's a big team, and it's done some pretty interesting and effective things. It has capabilities and a lot of experience in a number of disciplines that could be applied, I think, in areas other than pure aircraft and building and flying satellites. Certainly some of the things that we have done have found application in fields other than aeronautics and space, both as spin-offs and as direct applications of satellites, communication, weather, resource measurements, and things of this type. So what I'm really saying...
What is the resource measurements?
Oh, we've done some experimental work, for example, in looking at surveys of natural resources and crop resources. It's amazing what you can do. For example, I saw some pictures not too long ago taken from satellites where you could tell using special lenses and films, you could tell that the differences in the stage of growth of asparagus plants. It's fantastic. Things like that. You could do crop surveys if you wanted to do this. They've shown that if you're interested, for example, you could track migrations of caribou. You could tell where these herds move and from space, and pretty economically too. So there's a whole area of application in that area that hasn't really been tapped in any important way. But that's very directly related to the space activities. But I think that there are a number of these areas in our economy that are important to the economy and that depend upon the same type of technology and to an extent the same kind of facilities and talents that we have in our programs. So what I was thinking of talking to Webb about, and I plan to talk to him about, is the desirability of somebody looking really very hard at what position the agency should take in view of this changed environment we're living in and the fact that we're sitting here on a very important national resource. Should we, for example, say, okay, maybe we ought to become the supporting agency in the R&D area for the transportation department, which is kind of a holding company and doesn't now have its own laboratories and R&D and project management skill. The same, say for example, if you're going to do ground effect machines or something like this, or a railroad that runs on an air cushion. a lot of the aerodynamic information and the facilities and things that we have are just the sort of things you'd have to build to do that job. Now, in a sense, it's an expansion of the charter, but the thing I'm thinking is maybe somebody ought to take a good, hard look in kind of a quiet market survey way, you know, like you would for the president of a corporation, and say, look, our market's changed, the environment we work in is different, we're going to have to do a little diversifying. What are we capable of doing, and what are the needs of the country in this particular instance? And where do they match up? What does it mean to us if we were to get into these areas in terms of new relationships we'd have to develop? What political problems and social problems and economic problems does this imply? What dislocations would it create in our own agency? But the simple facts are that we have a lot of really competent, highly dedicated, and pretty talented people in that agency. And for one, I'm thoroughly convinced that they're there because there's a real challenging job to do. And there's a big investment in building this kind of a team. And it just seems to me that this kind of thing can fall apart on you rather quickly, and you've lost an awful lot of what you have in the sense of a team that knows how to work together and the facilities that go with it. Now, the DoD has similar problems, that they've got a different constraint on them, that they're committed to a very important part of the nation's program, and it's much more difficult, I would think, for them to readjust the use of their facilities and people than it might be in the case of NASA. So I just want to see what he thinks about this idea, and see whether or not we're so thoroughly committed to this dual role of aeronautics and space that he feels that we really couldn't spread out, or whether he'd be interested in taking a good hard look at it.
Have you discussed this with him before?
No, I really haven't. I know that he's mentioned this to some of his staff people. Now, his public comments on this matter have all been in the nature that they're really aimed right at space and aeronautics. They're very careful about that line. And I think his basic strategy at the present time in trying to defend the program and keep the organization going has been largely one involving the power of technology in the international relations business. The importance of maintaining continued growth in aeronautics and space technology because of the external competition of particularly Russia. And some of his recent talks have pointed out the very small balance that can exist in certain areas, the balance of power as a result of slight changes in technological base. One, for example, was the development by the Germans near the end of the Second World War of the jet airplane, and the fact that we by numbers were able to wear them out was about the only thing that saved us, in some people's opinion. If they'd had another 2 or 3 months head start on that thing, the outcome could have been very different. He maintains that that's the kind of thing where just a minor, a relatively small change in technology can have tremendous impact on your balance of international power.
Excuse me. Hello? No, you have the wrong number. Walter, it's now 5 o'clock. Are you? Can you talk for a few minutes more, or are you?
Yeah, I have
your
a 6:55 flight, so
well, let's
be okay for a few more minutes if I'm not keeping you here.
No, there's no problem as far as I'm concerned. I'm only concerned about your problem. Now, are you going to take a cab over?
Well, either that or if I have time, I may just take the subway. It just
All right.
depends on...
Now, you 6:55. Now, you would normally leave this area at...
What would
aren't you going to get
suggest?
some dinner first before you go?
I'm hoping there's a dinner on that flight. I may be a little late, but don't worry about that because it's a short flight down, and I'll be home by 8:30, 9 o'clock.
You're going back home now?
Yeah, right. So it's no problem.
Well, now, we could stop here, and you'd have a chance to get some dinner.
No, I don't mind that at all.
You don't? You sure?
Not if this is of any help. to
Oh,
you.
yes, this is very, very much so, and I, don't get to see you that often, so I'm...
Right.
Suppose that we plan to continue for another 15 minutes or so.
That'd
Is
be fine.
that agreeable?
Swell.
Good.
All right.
Well, going back to the oceanography again, you would see some possibility of NASA's taking on responsibilities there, again, as a research resource for other branches of the government?
Right. Now, I wouldn't want to put myself in the position of suggesting we either should or shouldn't. All I'm saying is that it's pretty obvious that the kind of capability that we have in the agency is to a large extent the same kind of capability that Lockheed, for example, has, and by golly, they're doing it. And I maintain that...
Doing what?
They're doing oceanography work, things like this.
They are? What are they doing?
Oh, they're building.
You know this. You know this for a fact.
I saw an article in a magazine today, an advertisement, which they pointed out that they're working on this deep sea recovery vehicle for the Navy as part of their oceanography program in the Navy. They go down and get samples. And a number of the aircraft companies have gotten into this type of thing. Many of the basic principles are identical, really.
Identical to...
Well, take the life support problems that you have in submarines. They're not that different than the kind of problems we've been confronted with in trying to maintain men in space. Somewhat different constraints, but basically it's the same sort of problem. Some of the power source work that we've been interested in is identical to the sort of thing they've been involved with. The aerodynamics and hydrodynamics bear many similarities. Some of the same laws apply. And you can go on and on. Lots of the same things. As a matter of fact, oceanography is one of the closest similarities. It's just a wet NASA, if you want to look at it that way. You can look at a few other areas that maybe are...
What do you think Webb will say about it? Do you think he's thought about this? Has this been proposed before you?
I'm sure he has, but
Right.
you have to realize that we've just now finished the Gemini program. We're just now getting into the early phases, the operational phase of Apollo, and getting out of the R&D business. There's a big adjustment that's got to be made. But they've been busier than the Dickens keeping the thing going and trying to meet these commitments. And it's really just been over about the last year or so that anybody's been really giving much serious thought to this problem. And of course the Vietnam situation has forced the problem quite a bit. The Great Society programs are in trouble, and there are a lot of people saying this is more important than space. They weren't saying that a year ago. So I guess what I'm saying is that there hadn't been much done on this problem yet, but I'm sure that people are aware of it. There's been no systematic study.
Now, the fact that you are going to make these suggestions to Webb, is this, do these grow out of the job that you now are doing in the agency? Walter, do you have a specific responsibility with respect to agency orientation, agency activity?
Well, I have had for the last few months, Stan. I've been assigned on this tour of duty for the last about 3 months, working in the Office of Policy Analysis. I went over there originally to...
Now, what is that, the Office of Policy?
It's a very small staff that works directly for Mr. Webb in doing analyses of important policy questions for him. For example, we've been working on the aeronautics policy, looking at what the present agency positions are on certain questions. What is the present NASA policy in aeronautics? What are the program objectives in a broad sense? And what are the governing principles under which we operate? What are the basic assumptions that these things are predicated upon? And then what analytically do these factors mean in terms of the problems we're confronted with, the world we live in today, the environment, the other factors? And then the document we prepared goes on to recommend some changes in the policy.
Now, how many of you are involved in that?
Well, on that particular one, there have been, I guess, maybe 3 or 4 fellows in the whole operation. Mm-hmm. Now, we've worked closely with the operational people to get the information, but they have...
Well, what operational people have you worked with on aeronautics, for example?
Well, we've worked with the people in the Office of Advanced Research and Technology who are responsible for the aeronautics program, for funding the research and deciding what major tasks would be included in the program. Now, they've provided information on what our policies have been. You find, I guess it's no surprise that very little of this has ever been written down. It's really amazing, really amazing. You as a lawyer would appreciate this because you know how these things grow, a kind of common law system. But
well, now, who originally set this, set the policy? You spoke earlier of Dryden's influence being a big factor in keeping the agency from having a larger involvement in aeronautics than it presently has.
Right.
But it has some involvement. Now, and you have some operating arms that exist with personnel and funds and labs and whatnot to work on various things. So a decision must have been made at some point to maintain at least that level of activity.
In the aeronautics program, as far as NASA is concerned, all they did was inherit the old NACA role and changed it very, very little.
The NACA, the
National Aeronautics and National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics.
I see.
In a sense, the kind of parent body of NASA, but almost an appendage to the present organization. It provided 4 or 5 of the major laboratories, but has not had too much to do with the big space operational programs like Apollo, other than providing a lot of the technology for it. This came out of the early aeronautics programs.
How long have you been in NASA?
About 6 years.
So you've seen, let's see, you came in, at what stage was it at the time you came in?
Glennon was still there.
Pardon?
Glennon was still the administrator. Let's see, the Mercury program had just gotten underway, and they were scurrying around trying to get the Tyros weather satellite going. The Advanced Research Projects Agency, the Department of Defense, had started that program, and it was turned over to NASA about this point. And the agency has really changed tremendously in the last 6 years. It was just getting off the ground. The Goddard Space Flight Center, I don't think they had hardly broken ground at that time. And Houston hadn't been built.
To what people do you attribute primarily the success of the various programs? The Gemini series is very successful, for example. Who have been the people who have distinguished themselves particularly in the management of other than Webb?
Well, there have been a lot of people, I suppose, who ought to get credit for this kind of a thing. Certainly the folks who are closest to the firing line within the government ranks are right down there in Houston now, Gilruth and his team. And in Washington, it's Dr. Miller and his people in the Apollo program, for example, General Phillips, who's a DOD man, very, very fine manager, was assigned to NASA. Of course, the industrial team deserves a lot of the credit, too. The military people have supported the operation extensively at the Cape and the recovery things. It's been a real big team operation. In many ways, I guess, particularly in the case of Apollo, some say this is the biggest the biggest scientific undertaking that mankind's ever tried, at least that we know of. We don't know what the Russians are really doing, but a very big team, very complex operation.
Are we going to do it? Do you think we're going to pull it off?
Yeah.
Do you really?
Right.
You're very confident inside the agency that it can be done?
Yeah. We've had some troubles lately with some of the hardware, but I think it's going to go.
This is a little bit off the main subject, but I was at Kennedy with the Sloans this fall. Saw the Gemini 11 shot, toured the Parrot Island moonport.
Did you?
I heard a lot of talk down there about this. Fascinated by it. I was just fascinated. I won't ever forget it. It's like I remarked to my family and friends that it was like leaving one civilization in the morning and coming onto a more advanced civilization that you stumbled on that you would not have believed existed.
Yeah.
But my experiences there caused me to think that Apollo was somewhat different from what had gone before, in that we were going by some large steps, whereas previously we'd gone by very small steps, and there were several things that had to be done to particularly the lunar excursion module and all the rest of it. I can't recall.
Yeah.
The sequence of details that are involved in the landing, and then the ascent from the moon surface, and the rendezvous and docking, and then the back to Earth, and then the re-entry problems, which I understand are all somewhat new and
much more difficult.
More difficult.
Right.
So I can't quite reconcile the enthusiasm I found there and your confidence that this all is going to go on schedule with the fact that there are several major new tasks which must go well if this is to succeed.
Well, you're right. It's going to be a very difficult task. I guess I am in part influenced by this a recent article that von Braun published, in which he was very, very confident.
He's an NASA employee.
Yes, he's the director of the center down at Huntsville. He's a NASA employee.
And he was confident that this can be done. And
yes, within the last few days he's had an article.
And you picked this up going on your rounds within the agency.
We've had pretty good luck on the previous programs. We hope it continues.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that the odds are very much in your favor, but I was struck by that fact. One of the chaps I talked with down there, a fellow who works on the Apollo program, Italian name, I don't know, I can't now recall what it was. He's so-called specially appointed by Kennedy, I guess. They call him Kennedy's man on the Apollo project. You know who I'm referring to?
No, I really don't.
Yeah. I was sitting at dinner with him, and he also, well, he's very much involved in the actual details. He was explaining to me that it all isn't so very new, that, you know, in some ways Gemini program has solved many of these things. But to someone as removed from it as myself, I had that reaction.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting, this policy. So these recommendations that you're going to make to Webb are a direct outgrowth of that work, I gather.
Well, in part. Of course, there are a lot of factors, I guess, that have influenced my thinking on this thing, but I suspect I wouldn't have looked at the problem the way I look at it today if I hadn't have been exposed to that type of an experience.
Are there any other recommendations that you plan to make in terms of NASA's?
No, I think basically what I'm going to try and do is interest him in the importance of this problem, and see if he isn't interested in having a kind of a quiet study done to just find out what sort of positions are available to him on this thing and what the consequences would be. It's I think one of these days he's just going to have to face up to some very difficult relationship problems between the DoD and NASA, and DoD and some of the other government, or rather NASA and some of the other government agencies.
Which, for example, which?
Well, DOT.
DOT,
right.
Yeah.
That'll be a prime one. And the more thinking that goes into preparing him for this, I think the better off he'll be. maybe a few of us can help him a little bit on this.
Well, boy, I'll be fascinated to know how it comes out if you're in a position to even give any kind of general indication of what kind of response you get. I'd appreciate it very much if you'd write. I realize that these are matters of high policy and not for public consumption. Just to wind up, Waller, are there some other experiences you've had since you've been out that relate to this whole general area of government policy formulation, the whole problem of identification? We've talked about the Bureau of the Budget, PPBS, and we've talked about the problem of DOT, that is the creation of DOT as a way of bringing together activities that have to do with transportation policy, research, and so on. What are some of your feelings about the kind of country we have at the moment, the tremendous impact of technology, science, and so on? It seems to me with the computer, the large economies of scale that we've introduced in terms of information, that the nation of the world changes sort of right under our eyes, and
tremendous rate.
The question of staying on top of all this and using it to our best advantage within the context of a democratic society and a society where most of the responsibility is going to be private, that's a very big task. I'm just wondering what you're very close to that whole business.
Well, I think this is one of the very interesting characteristics of NASA. It is since it's a peaceful civilian program, it's been possible to operate this thing as an open laboratory. And we've been able to invite in university groups and industrial groups to study what's going on within this agency in a way that no other government group has done so far. The thing that's interesting is this is one of the biggest R&D outfits in the world. It's all open to public view. The administrator is extremely interested in two areas: technology utilization, the spin-offs, how to make the productivity of the program benefit American industry and improve the standard of living. And he's very, very interested in this business of management technology. He feels that some of the important...
Who's this?
Mr. Webb.
Yeah.
He feels that many of the important contributions of the agency have been in the area of how to organize big technical teams, and that's the kind of technology we're in today. It's team technology. That's a characteristic of our day and age. And in ways in which you wouldn't be able to study General Motors, for example, you can study NASA. I think this is one of the real exciting things about that operation. And I think that NASA has a chance to, and to an extent has already done this, to really help the universities in this country make a quantum step forward in their knowledge of management and technology and science. And we have a limited number of these programs going on right now, where we have university professors coming in during the summer months and working in studies, right in the environment. And the general experience has been that these people go back, both in science and management, in the social sciences and so on, but they go back with a very different view of the world than they came with. And Webb talks about pulling the universities along, and I think to an extent that there's evidence that that's really what's happening. It's a really amazing thing. That this agency characteristically is at the cutting edge of science, and it's had such a big job to do in terms of some of the people problems that have been involved in the thing, that I think there are some very interesting lessons that can be gleaned from its experience in that area. So I guess I have had a feeling that this is a part of the NASA story that hasn't been told hardly at all to the general public, that the impact on American education that's coming from the space effort is just really something that very few people realize. Guys like Dr. Bisplinghoff, who'd been down in that environment and spent some time working as a part of the agency, now back up at MIT here, understand it very, very well. He wrote a very interesting paper on the justifications of the space program from the eyes of a college professor, what impact it has. And he thinks that the biggest impact is on the stimulation to the young people and the stimulation to the educational institutions, which have not yet been fully recognized. But, this is something you might want to take a look at sometime. Real interesting subject.
The civilian status of NASA and so on is an important reason, as you say.
Yeah.
It raises the question about NASA as a medium to work on international matters, and also maybe to put some of its expertise, make its expertise available for a variety of problems. I should think that one of the things NASA might consider, although it may not be have the right name, but in the field of the underdeveloped world, it would seem that because AID, but AID is primarily a personnel and
banking,
whereas what is needed is expertise, know-how. Raises the question whether NASA might evolve into an instrument whereby this country can interact in various ways that will be acceptable to others on problems that are obviously crying for serious examination, investigation, research, development, and so on. So it's very. I just don't know the government well enough to know what the alternatives might be. But I think this idea of evolving NASA into something which can do as well, potentially, with these other problems as it has done with its major assignment. I think it earned very high marks, obviously, and the assignment it was given. And its prestige in the country is very, very high. There is this underlying skepticism about what is this all going to do for us. It's a great stunt, idea. Of course, we have these vast urban other problems and so on down here.
Well, I don't think the international relationships or let's say foreign policy implications of NASA are very well understood by the public. This business that we live in a technological age has a very great significance in the fact that technology is power, just like military prowess is power too. And I don't think many people realize what a big factor this is in.
So you perceive NASA as a kind of technological bank, which makes it in some ways distinctive from any other entity within the government.
I think that's right. I really do.
So that to see NASA go down would represent a serious loss to this country. There are various options that the country has with NASA that it might not have without NASA, and to reorganize and pull together this thing together again might be very costly. And
that's why I think it's very important, as I view the problem, to look at other ways to apply these capabilities so that you maintain that critical mass and that open type program that can be displayed to the world. It shows the skills and capabilities as sort of a showcase for the country, a trade fair almost type thing, and it's a very effective one. And also this continued stimulation to education that I really believe.
I can see a new agency with a very unfortunate name emerging called the National Aeronautics Undersea Space Environmental Agency, NAUSEA, which would become involved both with undersea and also with environment. In other words, you add environmental in there. Now, I think the whole problem environment, like ESSA, it may be that the NASA organization is, as you say, better
I wouldn't say that we ought to be the general R&D lab for the government, but I'm surely convinced that we can do, it looks like we can do a lot more diversified activity than we are doing now.
Right.
And it may turn out that in the changed environment and with the different social problems that we face, that would be a good thing to do.
Well, this is all interesting material for the Sloans. I don't know whether you got into this kind of problem in the course at all.
No, we spent most of the time looking at some of the regulatory functions. And,
now, you found that valuable?
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty good course.
Do you recall specifically what principal new ideas you felt were formed at that time?
Well, I don't think of any particular new ideas, but a much better awareness of how the regulatory functions of government operate.
Yeah.
And what powers they have.
Yeah.
The restrictions.
Right. Have you had much contact with regulatory agencies?
Not really too much.
Yeah.
We're kind of in a funny category, as you can appreciate in our agency. Really, it's just a big science outfit, science and engineering outfit. Not really characteristic of a stereotype government agency.
You're sort of a new breed in the world in some ways. I guess there never was anything like NASA.
Not really. It really hasn't been.
No. Well, Walter, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your coming down.